Okay, perfect. We will get started. So hello everyone, my name's Lucy and I lead on the Compassionate Employers programme here at Hospice UK. Some of you may have been to previous sessions that we've run, previously run by our colleague Faith. She's now moved on to a new chapter in her life and I'm really thrilled to be stepping into her shoes to lead the programme going forward. For those of you on the call who don't know what we do as a team, we work with organisations across the UK to review policies, guidance and support to ensure they are equipped to support employees through some of life's most challenging times, specifically around the diagnosis of a terminal illness, caring responsibilities and bereavement. So each of you have had access today to this session because your employer is a member of the programme. And later in the session, we'll cover some of the things, including training and resources that are included in that membership, and make sure that you all have access as employees to your personal resource hub so that you can use all of those resources after today's session. Apologies if you can hear the beeping of people coming in. My colleague Paul is letting people in slowly. So this week is National Grief Awareness Week, and we are aiming to focus on increasing visibility and education to support ourselves and others through grief. So really, we are aiming to highlight how important each of our roles are developing in developing compassionate workplaces for everyone. So during this 1 hour session, we're going to be covering topics related to grief and bereavement. And throughout the session, I'd really like to welcome you to interact and share via the chat box if you feel comfortable to. If you are happy to, then please begin introducing yourselves, possibly where you're from and what you're hoping to get out of today's session. And at the end of the session, we will have time for questions. So please, there is a Q&A that's open, so please feel free to pop any questions in there and we will cover as many as possible. If we do have lots of questions, then we will come back to you independently if we don't get to cover them all today, but hopefully you'll find today nice and informative and you'll leave feeling better prepared to support yourself and those around you following a bereavement. So some of the key learning outcomes for today are what is grief and how will it impact us at work? What to say and not to say to a bereaved colleague or bereaved person in your life? Remembering a loved one during the festive period, looking after yourself and some self-care tips, and importantly, signposting that's available for yourselves and for others through different resources and support. Now, due to the nature of this topic, I always like to remind people that actually it's really important to look after ourselves. If you feel triggered or upset throughout any of the session by any of the content, then please feel free to take time out. I will not take it personally. And there will be a recording that you can watch back at another time. It's okay if you woke up today and you thought, I'm going to go to this session, but actually it's okay if it's not the day to engage with this. You can come back to it at the best time for you. We'd also recommend that you do take 10 to 15 minutes after this session just to step away from your screens and get yourself a drink or something to eat, get yourself some fresh air, or just have some quiet time for reflection. We know that, as a society, we're not very good at talking about death and dying. And so these sessions can really trigger emotions in us that possibly have not been looked at for a long time. So make sure that you are looking after yourselves and taking the time that you need to just really reflect on everything that might come up today. So I like to start these sessions by setting the scene. We're currently conducting some research to update our data ahead of the 5-year anniversary of COVID, which shockingly will be in March next year. Can't believe how quickly those last 5 years have gone. But for now, we're going to focus on the data that we know. So between 2018 and 2023, we know that 57% of employees experienced a bereavement. And we know that only 1 in 5 managers feel confident supporting someone they manage following a bereavement, many referencing their own personal experience as the only reason why they knew what to do or how to support somebody. 51% of people say that they fear saying the wrong thing to someone who's recently been bereaved, which often leads to people saying nothing at all. And 58% of bereaved employees felt their performance was still affected by their grief months on from their bereavement. I think it's important to highlight this straight away because many of us are unaware of how many people in our close networks are going through grief. And this is a really good reminder for all of us just how many people are impacted. So to get started with the session, we're going to start with some key definitions. So bereavement is the experience of someone important to us dying. And grief is the emotional reaction to loss, whether through death or through a living loss. Disenfranchised grief is a term that you may never have heard of before, but you may well resonate with. It's often feels very similar to grief through bereavement, but it's quite often misunderstood and undervalued and quite often invalidated by our social norms. Some of the examples that you might have experienced may be the breakdown of a relationship or a divorce, having estranged friendships or estranged relationships with your family. They can even be things such as moving homes or countries or the loss of a job. An anticipatory grief. This refers to the feelings of grief or loss that you may feel before a loss actually happens. We often see anticipatory grief in those who are living with a terminal or life-limiting condition, or those who are anticipating the death of someone that they love. So what does grief look like? So looking at the words on the screens, do you immediately think of any symptoms that you might expect from somebody who's been bereaved, or do you resonate and think about some of the things that could come into play for you? If you've got anything in the chat box, can you think of any symptoms that you might associate with grief? Caroline, withdrawn, absolutely. Tearful, fatigued, disengagement, anxiety, lack of focus. We definitely hear a lot about lack of focus and that brain fog that comes. Insomnia, guilt, emotionally exhausted, yeah. Lack of concentration, lack of confidence, that's a really big one. Anger, absolutely. Isolation. Brilliant. There's some really great suggestions there, and thank you very much, everybody, for sharing. So when we're talking about emotional, of course, sadness comes into play. There is anger. There's often the anger at the person or at the world, angry that your person has died, angry that this is happening to you. Fear and anxiety, really common. Who's going to die next? You know, how do I relax in this heightened state of anxiety? Shock, even if a death isn't sudden, the finality of death can feel really shocking. And we see that with a lot of people who experience anticipatory grief. Numbness, total overwhelm can just send us into survival mode. It can make us numb. It can make us numb to all of the feelings in the world around us. Loneliness, helplessness, guilt. Additionally, people may feel acceptance or relief. It's really important for us to talk about this because it's something that we quite often feel really guilty about. But for many who are living with anticipatory grief, watching someone we care about in pain or suffering, there can be a huge sense of relief once they are at rest. Knowing that they don't have to suffer anymore, and knowing that you don't have to worry about them can bring a huge sense of relief. When we're looking at kind of the cognitive impacts, it could be that decreased ability to concentrate and process information, that difficulty in decision making, that forgetfulness. We talk about brain fog, and we've worked with many people who for months and months, possibly for years afterwards, feel really frustrated by the impact that it's having on their ability to function as normal, and how tasks that were previously easy feel quite complicated and really exhausting now. When we're looking at behaviours, we might see people withdrawn from social interaction. They might feel irritable or short. Within families, this might feel like you're walking on eggshells. Within teams, it might feel like you're walking on eggshells. Sometimes people may seem like they're hypersensitive, reacting to topics that previously wouldn't have fazed them. We often shy away from talking about the physical side effects of grief, but nearly everyone that we've spoken to have experienced one of the following. So sleep disturbances, weight loss or weight gain, aches and pains, you're physically very fatigued. Some people struggle with IBS. Many people end up having horrible headaches or just being so physically run down that they end up poorly, just back-to-back illnesses, especially through these winter months. When we're looking at spiritually, it's important to be really sensitive that grief can really change somebody's perspective on grief, on faith. It can make them question the meaning of life or their belief systems. Or on the flip side, it can really inspire people to really leave very heavily into their faith, becoming more active within their faith community or changing their practices of worship. So you can see why it's so important to talk about this. When we're welcoming somebody back to work following bereavement, are we really being mindful of all of the additional symptoms and side effects that they may be experiencing? It's really important to also remember that no two experiences of grief will be the same. And sometimes these symptoms may come and go, but it's really important to be mindful whilst you're supporting yourself or someone else that this might look different every time that you experience a bereavement, or it might look different from somebody that you are supporting. And if you're supporting somebody through multiple losses, it's really important to look at this holistically and think, how do we communicate the things that are impacting them and how do we support them at work following that? Now, I don't like to lean too heavily into grief models because I know that grief is already such a complicated topic. However, the dual process model can be really helpful to visualize how grief works for many people. So this model highlights how we bounce between loss-orientated coping and restoration-orientated coping. So during the loss days, we may lean really heavily into our grief. We might sit in the sadness and focus on life before our loved one died. I often refer to these days as duvet days. They're the days where we feel so weighted down by our grief that we can barely peel ourselves out of bed or off of the sofa. But during restoration days, we may lean into making new memories, forming new relationships, figuring out our new identity now that our loved one has died. I find that this model is particularly helpful in the workplace for managers and colleagues. It can really help to highlight how grief ebbs and flows, and that employees may seem fine one day, but they may seem to struggle the next. So in the loss coping stage, an employee might find it really hard to concentrate on tasks. They may feel withdrawn during meetings or struggle to socialise with colleagues. But the same employee a few days later may come into work and seem really focused on their tasks, engaging with social events, leaning into project work. And what's really important to recognise is that grief is not linear, and it's really important to be prepared to support employees as they may bounce back and forth between loss and restoration, sometimes for months and sometimes for years. We often make the mistake of seeing people in those restoration phases and think they seem fine, they're coping really well, or, they're moving on. But actually, there's no finish line for grief. However, we all play a role in providing compassionate and flexible working environments where people feel like they can strive more towards those restoration days. We're going to talk a little bit about what to say and what not to say. And it's often the first thing that people ask us to talk about. It's the thing that we're all quite scared of, because it's natural to feel unsure of what to say to somebody who's just experienced a loss. Many people really worry about saying the wrong thing. And unfortunately, some of the really common phrases can cause more harm than comfort. So we're going to have a little think about the phrases that we might want to try and avoid. And I've put some on the screen, but it would be good if there's any suggestions in the chat of things that you've heard people say and you think, oh, that doesn't sit well with me, or things that people have said to you that haven't landed well. So we've got things like, I know exactly how you feel. I guess it was their time to go. They lived a long time. At least they didn't die young. Everything happens for a reason. You'll get through it. Be strong. They're in a better place. Yeah, Helena. Well, they were sick. Chin up. I know that you've got a lot going on, but could you just look at this thing for me? That's a guilty, and especially in the workplace. It is definitely worse when people say nothing at all. That silence can be deafening. Oh, you'll be okay. Oh gosh, that's awful. That's the way life is. Yep. They had a good innings. Who wouldn't want you to be unhappy? It is, yeah, it's shocking. And the chat really confirms that we're not alone in these silly things being said to us, or we're hearing these silly things. And it's our role within our organizations to be looking out for when those things are being said, so that we can call them out and we can call people in and say, actually, it's not very nice to say those sorts of things. It might be better to phrase it like this. But a lot of people, while these phrases are well-meaning, they are dismissive, and they can be really dismissive of somebody's pain. So each of these phrases minimize somebody's grief or shifts the focus away from that individual experience, which can really put the pressure on of somebody to react a certain way or make them feel invalidated in the way that they're feeling. One of the things that's very common is for us to begin to overshare. It's very easy for us to find common ground when somebody experiences a bereavement, if we've also experienced a bereavement. But it's important to be mindful when you're sharing personal experiences without permission. So make sure that you are holding the space and prioritizing that bereaved person over your own emotions. Sometimes just a gentle suggestion of, I can really resonate with those feelings, can give people the permission to lean in and share experiences if they wish, and not feel the pressure to kind of support you back in that moment. So what could we say instead? And it'd be great to hear any suggestions of the really helpful things that people have said to you following a bereavement. It's important to highlight the ones that were challenging, but actually, have you had somebody really lean in and say something that really supported you in those early days? The best approach is being compassionate, acknowledging their feelings, listening, and saying something. I know we had a couple of comments saying, when people say nothing at all, it's worse, and we hear that frequently. But the key thing to remember is that grief isn't a problem to solve. We are a society of fixers, but we can't bring that person back. But we can be a compassionate listener, and that can be so much more powerful than offering solutions. The right words are different to everyone, and everybody will have their own opinions on what feels right for them. But the best way to kind of navigate these conversations is to try and follow the bereaved person's lead for appropriate language and cues on how comfortable they are to talk. So when I talk about appropriate language, I mean things like, are they using the word loss, or are they using the word died? I lost my dad. I'm really sorry that you lost your dad. My dad died. I'm really sorry that your dad died. We can learn from the language that they're using, and we can adapt that so that we can lead a really compassionate conversation. Some of those on here, I can't imagine what you're going through. I'm so sorry for your loss. If you're comfortable to share, I'd love to hear more about them. Whenever you want to talk, just know I'm only a phone calls or a Teams away. And importantly, I don't know what to say. I wish I had the right words to comfort you. I'm just so sorry. It's okay to say that you don't know what to say. You're not meant to be an expert, but saying something is always So much better than nothing. Yeah, some really great examples on here. I'm sorry that you and your family are going through such a hard time. Giving someone a hug, absolutely. If it's there, if people are happy to accept contact, then giving someone a hug and just holding them for a minute is really nice. What are you going to do now? Yeah, I'll come and visit you at the weekend and drink lots of tea like we did with your mum. That's really sweet. Absolutely. And when we can resonate it back to that person, if you have a personal connection to that person who's died or you've met them, it can be really nice to share a memory in that moment. Using the person's name, absolutely. Letting the person talk about them, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I think the whenever you want to talk about it is an interesting one, and I always question whether it's the right terminology, because actually it's a bit like us saying how are you, and everybody goes yeah fine, and it's just past in the moment, and actually it might be that you see somebody and you see that they're struggling and you say, I know that you've been through something. Should we put some time aside and have a cup of tea and we can talk about how you're feeling and how I might be able to support you going forward. Thanks so much, everybody, for sharing there. Some really, really great suggestions. Can't imagine the pain, but I care so much for you, especially in your sadness. Absolutely. Just saying, I care for you. I'm here for you. Making people aware. And actually, one of the things that we've been talking about recently is that as a society, we used to lean into our neighborhoods, into faith groups, into community groups, and they were our support network. And as the movement of people has happened, and as we live further away from our childhood friends or our family, we are leaning into our work colleagues for support in so many areas of our lives. And actually, we do really care about our work colleagues a lot of the time. So being really honest with them and saying, like, I'm here with you. Is there anything practical that I can do to help? Can be a really great thing to do as well. We're going to talk a little bit about how to hold a compassionate conversation. So we know what to say, what not to say. We've had some brilliant suggestions there in the comment box. But we've got 6 key principles that we designed as part of our compassionate conversations training, something that you all have access to on the Members Hub, which we'll make sure we circulate after this. So number 1 is listen attentively. So paying undivided attention, being present in that conversation and not just listening to respond. If you're in a work setting, think about how you can minimize distractions so you can be fully present. We are all guilty of sending off a quick email while somebody's on Teams, or having Teams pinging away in the background. Turn on Do Not Disturb. Find a private room, avoid busy settings. If it feels appropriate, ask that person if they want to go for a walk. It doesn't have to be sitting at your desk having a conversation. Try and make the space where that person can be vulnerable. Respond mindfully. So take a moment to process before you respond. Consider what they've said to you. Consider what you've heard so that you can really build on that conversation. This is really helpful whilst you're trying to mimic their language, as we were talking about. My dad has died. I lost my dad. It's really helpful if you're able to respond mindfully and take stock of what they've said, especially if they're sharing memories that then you can reference back within the conversation as well. Be observant. So notice details in body language, notice their mood, their attitude. Try and remain in an open stance, be patient whilst they talk, try not to seem restless. It can be quite easy to feel quite fidgety in these conversations because it might be the first time that you've sat in a conversation like this. It can make people, but that can make people feel like maybe you've got somewhere else to be, or they can visibly see that the conversation is making you uncomfortable. So where you can, try and prepare yourself for that conversation and sit in a very calm stance so that people feel that they can open up and be vulnerable with you. Manage silence, learning to sit comfortably in silence. It's not something that we're very good at as a society, and it's something that I'm personally trying to work on more. But silence is really healthy, and sometimes it's sitting with somebody in that silence that is the comfort that they need. So try it. Try sitting in silence. Try and sit in the discomfort of it. And actually, this e-learning is really helpful for that. It's a really helpful tool for developing that. Respect their emotions. So acknowledge all of the emotions that are coming up, and don't try and deny any of the ones that you don't necessarily relate to. Try where you can to remain neutral. We all have a different experience to grief. So if you're supporting somebody who's telling you about how they're feeling and that's not how you felt when your person died, don't feel like you need to say, are you sure you're not feeling like this? Are you sure you don't want to keep going with things? Make sure that you're not trying to suggest that they should be feeling any other way. We're not here to fix. We're here to hold space. We're here to listen. Consider other perspectives. So welcome other experiences, withhold any judgment, and try not to project your own experiences back on that person. So looping back to that previous slide, just be mindful when you're sharing personal experiences. Make sure that there is permission to do so if it's appropriate to. It can be helpful for some people, but make sure that you're prioritizing their needs over your own emotions. Is there any reflections on conversations? Yeah, allowing people to feel like they're in a safe space without being told to come or go for a walk. Absolutely. Create the space. It's okay to say, actually, right now isn't the right time for us to have this conversation, because I want to make sure that we are in a protected space where we are not going to be interrupted, where we have unlimited tea or biscuits, and that I can be fully present to be in this conversation and be in this moment with you. Let's go find that space together, or let's plan a time this week that we can sit in that space together so I can give you my undivided attention. Oh, Samantha, I'm so sorry that somebody told you that. Yeah, grief, it doesn't have a finish line. That's one of the things that we're hoping to get out of today. We know that a lot of people think that after a few months, after a year, it's time to move on. And actually, the next couple of slides will hopefully help lean into that conversation about why that's actually not very accurate. So we're going to talk about this model, which is called Growing Around Grief. In particular, talking about coping with grief through the festive season, through anniversaries, through celebrations. It can be really hard. And I think this model in particular works really well, especially in organizations, to understand how it's not linear, how grief changes over time, and that it doesn't go away. So Growing Around Grief is a model that was created by a counsellor called Lois Tonkin. And Tonkin came up with this model after speaking to a client about the death of their child. The woman told Tonkin that at first grief filled every part of her life. It was all consuming. She drew a picture with a circle to represent her life and shaded it in to indicate her grief. She thought that as time went on, that grief would shrink and it would become a much smaller part of her life. But actually, what happened was different. The grief stayed the same size, but her life began to evolve around it. Now, the key thing is that there were times that grief felt just as intense over the years and months that followed as when her child first died. But there were also other times that she felt like she could begin to live her life in the space outside of that grief. And I like this visualization because there's something about seeing this jar getting bigger and bigger and knowing that capacity can grow for our life to grow around our grief, and that grief stays the same size. This model helps to highlight that it doesn't grief doesn't diminish over time, but our life expands around it. And there will be moments and days where you feel that grief as intensely as the day that you first felt that loss. But there will be times where you feel like the life around it is consuming you and that grief is running alongside it. So as we approach Christmas and the festive period, and thinking about significant dates, it can feel very overwhelming and it can feel like we're going to be completely debilitated. But this model is a really healthy reminder that we actually don't need to shrink our grief. We don't need to hide away from it. But instead, it's about creating a life that can grow around it and living alongside that grief and honouring it in different ways as time goes on. That's a helpful model because I said at the beginning that I wasn't going to lean too much into grief models because I didn't want to overcomplicate, but I do find that those two models in particular feel very relatable whenever I use them in these sorts of sessions. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the festive period because we are not long away from it now. And it can be really particularly hard for people who are living alongside grief, and particularly hard for people who are possibly in their first year or couple of years. And I'd love to hear any suggestions that you have. If you're happy to share in the chat box, one of the things that I find always resonates with people on these calls is hearing what other people do to remember their loved ones. But there's some suggestions here. Laying a place at the table for them, lighting a candle, saying a few words, reading a poem, visiting somewhere that maybe reminds you of them, or visiting their resting place if there is one for them, listening to their favourite music or watching their favourite TV show. For me, the best advice I ever received was to make time for my grief, to have a dedicated moment of the day that helped free up some capacity and actually, grow that space around my grief so that I could allow myself to make happy memories, to live alongside those emotions. I'm just going to have a look at the chat. Have we got any suggestions? Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, Christmas is a really, really difficult time, even more so if your anniversaries are colliding with the festive season. We know that it can be very triggering being on things like social media and watching these picture perfect families, and it can be quite upsetting. So just we'll come on to a bit around self-care, but run up to anniversaries are very difficult at the best of times, and when they are being collided with festive seasons as well, it's increasingly hard. Thanks, Chris, for sharing. And actually, we can pick up a little bit about the death of a colleague. We do have some resources on our hub around supporting people following the death of a colleague. So I'll make sure that we get those over to you after this. I go to my mum's bedroom and I tell her what I've been up to. I love that. I really enjoy that. Oh yeah, those unexpected grief triggers, Vicky. Crying in Asda whilst you're walking past the dad, Christmas cards. I think that there will be lots of people who resonate with that feeling. This not just for Christmas, but also for Father's Day and Mother's Day and all of the other birthdays and celebrations that happen throughout the years. Taken to Oh, that's really lovely, Rebecca, sharing that you decorate your house and tree with your friend's daughter whilst talking about your dad. That's really, really special. I think that's it. Bringing them up in conversation is really important. And Samantha, your first Christmas without your mum, I'm so sorry. And often we talk about, the people who make Christmas are the mums of the family. They are the people who, that's actually what the Christmas spirit is. So I'm thinking of you. We hear that quite often. Gosh, so many of you are sharing, and I really appreciate it. And I want you to know that within these sessions, one of the most powerful things, and one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this and talking about this, is because often we don't have a space to share our vulnerabilities. And coming along to these sorts of sessions and holding the space for people to be vulnerable in, you see all of these people who resonate with each other and have so much shared experience. So I really appreciate it. You put up your Christmas cards or cards, Becky, from your mum. Oh, sweet. Baubles for the tree, really lovely. Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of amazing kind of in memory baubles, Christmas decorations, candles that you can buy, which can be a really nice way of bringing people into it. Perfect. Thank you so much, everybody, for sharing. We're going to talk a little bit about self-care because it's very important. As we've seen in the chat. So here's some tips around self-care, especially at the holidays. Talking. So don't worry about upsetting others. If talking about the person who died feels right for you, then do it. Share memories and stories, and really importantly, don't be afraid to laugh, smile, cry, remembering them. Let all of those emotions flow. Talking about people can be a really wonderful way to bring them into the present day, and to hear stories that you maybe haven't heard before from your friends and family and sometimes colleagues. Set boundaries, something that we probably all need to practice a little bit better, but the holiday season is overwhelming at the best of times. Many of us are being pulled from one direction to another, trying to keep everybody happy. So just remember that if you are dealing with grief this year, first year, or many years down the line, make sure that you set boundaries. If you need time to yourself, do it. Don't worry about who else it impacts. Make sure that you are looking after yourself. Find your own ways to honour them. Perhaps some of the suggestions in the chat that you've just heard there, or some of the things from the previous slide, will be nice ways for you to honour them or to start new traditions. One of the things that I think I keep repeating at the moment is that it's never too late to grieve. Many of us have experienced a loss in our life, and we've maybe not processed or had the support around us to process that loss. And it's not too late to start doing new traditions and remembering those people now. It's okay if it's 5 years, 10 years, however long down the line. It's never too late to start remembering the person who you love. Set realistic expectations. It's okay to feel sad. It's okay to feel angry, upset. It's okay if you don't feel like it's the most wonderful time of the year. Sometimes seeing picture perfect families can be really triggering. So maybe explore options for limiting triggers, taking a break from social media, maybe avoiding the card section or avoiding supermarkets altogether at this time of year. It can be really upsetting, and you just don't know where those triggers are necessarily going to come from. But if you know that they exist, trying to limit them. Allowing yourself to feel all the feelings. So yeah, I'm sorry, you can't outrun grief. There's a lot of emotions that come with it. And you've seen all the ways that grief can impact us earlier on in those slides. So let the emotions flow to free up some capacity to let those nice feelings in. But also, don't feel pressured to feel a certain way. You might feel nothing when it comes to Christmas. You might have this big build up to Christmas Day and you might feel nothing. But the main thing is you let whatever emotion within you arise, you give it space, you give it time, and you give it energy so that you can process and hopefully make some nice memories around a really difficult time. And lastly, checking in with your needs. Reach out for hugs if that's what you like, or don't. Let people in, let people around you know that you need extra patience, extra love. Communicate with those who you feel closest to and make sure that they're able to carry some of that weight. If you are facing your first Christmas and you're feeling particularly triggered by it, at the moment, and you're thinking about it in a work sense, then my biggest piece of advice is to communicate. Communicate with your manager, let them know what the next few weeks look like for you at work. Talk about how you might be able to deprioritize things, talk about what additional support you might need, take time off if you need that time off. Try not to rush yourself into Christmas by keeping yourself too busy to function, because it catches up with you. You need to make that time and that space to be able to, to process those big emotions that might be coming up for you. One thing that I haven't included in this, but was really helpful, or I wish somebody would have told me, was that actually Christmas felt okay first year, but New Year's Eve was really challenging. There was a concept of leaving my person in the year and them never carrying on after that year, that I found really challenging. And we've spoken to people since, and we've got some resources around coping on New Year's Eve as well, because we know that that is quite often the case, is that people struggle, particularly around New Year's, and just the end of the year, leaving somebody in that year and then being there. So I'm just going to kind of finish off the session before we have some time for Q&A and any other reflections, just highlighting the resource hub that we've got. So some of you will hopefully have seen this, some of you may not have seen this. After this session, we will make sure that you all have access to your unique links, which will be provided by your organisation. So as a member, you all have access to the resource hub. You can access it from your personal phones or laptops. You don't have to be, it's not on a SharePoint site or anything. So if you are off work, or if it's over the Christmas period and you want to just find some support, some resources, read or listen or watch, this is accessible. So when you get onto the site, you can select from the drop down, who it is, whether you're an employee, whether you're a line manager, whether you work in HR, whether you're looking for something in particular, so that we can make sure we get you to the right place as quickly as possible. And then from there, we have sort of a bespoke section for bereaved people, or people who are facing a terminal diagnosis or a diagnosis of somebody that they care about, or if you have caring responsibilities. There are lots of different types of resources on there. And then additionally, if you're a line manager and you'd like some guidance and some steps, there are step-by-step guidance on here, and additional webinars and subject-specific matters such as baby loss, supporting carers, death in service, which might be applicable to Chris, I think, from earlier. All employees as well have access to our e-learning, so please go on there and utilise this. We created it a few years ago with PwC. It's just 30 minutes long, and it will equip you with the skills that you need to sit in the silence and hold compassionate conversations. The focus is around bereavement, but actually the skills are very transferable to lots of different topics. Ultimately, it gives you the skills to support colleagues through hardship of all different kinds. So yeah, please do go on there and have a look. If you're looking for some specific signposting support after today, we would recommend these different organisations. So Atalos is designed to ensure that every bereaved person, wherever they are, whatever the bereavement and however long ago it was, can find all of the relevant support that's available for them. So signposting is one of the biggest challenges with grief. It can be a long wait list to get to bereavement support if we are going through the NHS. So this site is all about signposting people to national and local support systems, and it's also a huge resource hub for books and podcasts and blogs and lots of amazing different things. So check that out if you are looking for some support, and we'll share all the links to these things afterwards as well. Let's Talk About Loss run meetup groups for UK young people aged 18 to 35. They've got 35 different meetups, and they're in every major city across the UK. Widowed and Young support men and women following the death of a spouse before they're 50. Tommies support families following the death of a baby and have a huge resource hub as well as a dedicated helpline. Child Bereavement UK support children and young people up to the age of 25 when somebody important to them has died or is not expected to live. And they also support parents when a child has died or is dying from a terminal condition. And Sue Ryder offers general bereavement support. They also have a free telephone counselling line and help text support, as well as an online bereavement community. So just if you're looking to lean into some support over the Christmas period, there are some amazing organisations out there who are there to support you. So that's the end of my presentation. We always like to leave. I don't like to talk for an hour because it's a lot of information. It can be overwhelming.